Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Sophomore English. We turn now in Unit 5, our drama unit. After having studied Antigone, after having briefly looked at a play by Ibsen, a short-cutting enemy of the people, we're going to now go to Julius Caesar, Shakespeare's classic. I'm with you on page 884, and I just want to help you now go through this information, preparing to read the tragedy of Julius Caesar. I hope that you'll read along with me, that you're bullet pointing with me as we go. William Shakespeare wrote masterpieces of drama poetry during an extraordinary era in English history. Now, much of this will be a review from your freshman year when we studied Romeo and Juliet as well as Midsummer Night's Dream and Much Ado About Nothing together. Let's begin with some historical background. Elizabethan England, a golden age. Queen Elizabeth I came to the throne following a tumultuous period in English history. During the reign of her father, King Henry VIII, thousands of people had been executed. Warfare had been frequent. The royal treasury was drained. The brief reigns of Elizabeth's half-brother Edward and half-sister Mary were equally stormy. Elizabeth, by contrast, proved to be a strong and successful ruler, frugal with money and popular with the people. Her long reign, put it in your notes, 1558 to 1603, is often seen as a golden age in English history. The relative stability that Elizabeth created allowed commerce and culture to thrive. The next term you definitely need in your notes, it's one that we'll come back to in your senior year again, the Renaissance. Elizabeth ruled toward the end of a flowering of European learning known as the Renaissance. The Renaissance began in Florence and other Italian city-states around 1350, usually sometimes with either Machiavelli or Dante both being mentioned, and then spread throughout Europe. The word Renaissance means rebirth or rediscovery. And the era saw renewed interest in the arts and sciences that harkened back to ancient Greece and Rome. So write this in your notes. The Renaissance is a rediscovery of Greco-Roman thought. The cultural pursuit of art and learning had diminished in Western Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. Influenced by the achievements of the ancients, Renaissance writers and architects created new forms and designs that emphasized individual human expression. Painters and sculptors studied ancient Greek and Roman art to explore a new focus on the human form. Philosophers and religious reformers challenged old ideas, as did scientists who strove to unlock the hidden secrets of the natural world. With new knowledge of the skies, navigators sailed the globe, expanding trade and exploring distant lands. The English Renaissance. Elizabeth I encouraged commercial enterprise and the efforts of English navigators such as Sir Walter Raleigh, who tried to establish a colony in Virginia, and Sir Francis Drake, who sailed around the globe. Profiting particularly from the wool trade, a strong merchant class developed in England, narrowing the gap between rich and poor. London, with nearly 200,000 people, became Europe's largest city. It was a bustling and dirty cultural and political capital that attracted newcomers from overseas as well as from the English countryside. In 1588, the English army defeated the Spanish Armada. This is a huge date, year 1588. The defeat of the Spanish Armada, a fleet of warships sent by King Philip II of Spain to invade England. The victory contributed to Elizabeth's legend, as well as to the country's sense of national pride. It also set England firmly on the path to becoming ruler of the seas. Elizabeth's reign was not only remarkable for its commercial and military success, indeed her court was a center for musicians and artists, both continental and native-born. The philosopher Sir Francis Bacon, put a note, we'll study him in our senior year together. We'll look at his essay of studies. Sir Francis Bacon, who pioneered the informal essay as a literary form, became an unofficial member of the Queen's group of advisors. Sir Philip Sidney, another writer that we'll study in our senior year, a poet, a popular courtier and diplomat, wrote a series of love sonnets that were much imitated. The poet Edmund Spenser, put his name down, we'll study him also in our senior year, wrote an adventure-packed epic called The Faerie Queen that he dedicated to Queen Elizabeth. We'll study Faerie Queen, especially in our study together of John Milton's Paradise Lost. The greatest Elizabethan literature, however, was written for the stage. The greatest of these voices were the playwrights, Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, and of course the greatest of them all, William Shakespeare. By the way, up at the top of 885, notice the great chain of being. In Shakespeare Alive, Joseph Papp, founder of the New York Shakespeare Festival, and his co-author Elizabeth Kirkland, explained how Shakespeare and his audience viewed nature and society. Just read this with me. In the heavenly kingdom, several layers of archangels and angels spread downwards from God's throne, and each level knew its place. The universe was a hierarchy too, and each planet and star was assigned to a specific position. The animal world was another very stratified society in which each species had its king. The eagle was the king of the birds, the whale was the king of the fish, the lion, of course, was the king of beasts. The great chain of being, stretching from the lowest creature in the natural world all the way up to God, connected these worlds to each other, and the hierarchy of one was mirrored in the others. Since all living things were linked by the great chain of being, violations of order in society were thought to set off violent disturbances in the heavens or the world of nature. In Julius Caesar, Act 1, Scene 3, for example, strange and terrible goings-on are reported in Rome as the conspirators hatch an assassination plot against the emperor. Back down to the bottom of 885, the concern for stability. Oh, I'm sorry, let's jump over quickly to the box there on 885. A sonnet from the Italian for a little song. We obviously studied these when we did our poetry unit, yes? Our sonnet from the Italian for a little song is a 14-line poem originally developed in Italy. Sidney's sonnets ushered in a sonnet-writing craze. Edmund Spenser, William Shakespeare, just about every other Elizabethan poet produced a sonnet sequence or series. Now back to the concern for stability. Elizabeth's father, King Henry VIII, had married 6 times. He divorced 3 of his wives, executed 2 others, including Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn. Queen Mary, Elizabeth's half-sister, infuriated the nation by wedding Philip II of Spain, who abandoned her soon afterwards. Perhaps because of these examples, or perhaps because she worried about sharing power, Elizabeth I never married, often referred to as the Virgin Queen for this reason. By the late 1590s, when Shakespeare wrote the tragedy of Julius Caesar, she was quite advanced in years, and many were concerned about the nation's stability after her death. That concern is echoed in several of Shakespeare's plays, including Julius Caesar. Let's turn now to 886a, and we're going to learn a little bit about theater in Elizabethan England. London theaters drew crowds that are large even by today's standards. During the Elizabethan era, the religious plays of the Middle Ages gave way to English tragedies and comedies molded on those of ancient Greece and Rome. Scholars at Oxford and Cambridge universities studied and translated the ancient plays into English. The first great Elizabethan playwrights attended those universities, which is why they are sometimes called the university wits. The most prominent of the wits, Christopher Marlowe, pioneered the use of blank verse in drama. For more on blank verse, see page 915. For a time, Elizabethan acting companies still traveled the countryside as their medieval counterparts had done. They performed at festivals, inns, and castles. Gradually, however, the better acting companies acquired noble patrons or sponsors and began staging private performances in their patrons' homes. They also gave performances at court where elaborate masks, productions featuring singing and dancing, were especially popular. From the theater to the globe, next heading. England's first public theater opened in 1576, known simply as the Theatre. It was built by the actor James Burbage, whose company would later attract the young William Shakespeare. Since the performance of plays was banned in London proper, Burgess put the theater just outside the city walls. When its lease expired, Richard Burbage, who took charge of the company after his father's death, decided to move operations to Southwark, just south across the River Thames from London. He built a new theater called the Globe, which opened in 1599. Write that down. The Globe Theater opens in 1599. Shakespeare's first play to be performed there was probably the tragedy of Julius Caesar. Let's learn about the theater structure quickly. England's first theaters were 2 or 3-story structures with a central space open to the sky. The open space was surrounded by enclosing seating in 2 or 3 tiers or galleries that faced inward. On the ground floor, a stage projected onto an area called the pit. Audience members, called groundlings, paid a small fee to stand in the pit and watch the play. Wealthier audience members, including aristocrats, occupied the more expensive, sheltered gallery seats. Since artificial light was not used, performances generally took place in the afternoon. Audiences were boisterous, cheering and booing loudly. Most theaters could hold up to 3,000 people and drew the largest crowds on holidays. On 886b, theater stagecraft. The portion of the building behind the stage was used to mount the production. This area, including dressing rooms, storage rooms, and waiting rooms from which actors could enter and exit the stage, sometimes called the tiring houses. The second level gallery, directly above the stage, served as a performance space. There was no scenery, instead, settings were communicated through dialogue. Special effects were very simple. Smoke might accompany a battle scene, for example. Actors playing members of the nobility or royalty wore elegant clothes. These were not really costumes as we think of them today, but simply the same types of clothing worn by high-ranking Elizabethans. Since acting was not considered proper for women, female roles were played by boys or about 11 or 12 years old, before their voices had changed. Given the constraints of the era stagecraft, the productions were unrealistic by modern standards. However, they were also fast-paced, colorful, and highly entertaining. By the way, see your box on 886b. There, the upper stage could be used for particular scenes or to stage a scene with actors on 2 levels. It was also the seating area for musicians, an important part of many productions. Several of Shakespeare's plays, particularly the comedies, contained songs. The Blackfriars. This is important, write this in your notes. In 1609, Shakespeare's company, the King's Men, began staging plays at an indoor theater called the Blackfriars. There, they still used the globe during the summer months. The Blackfriars was one of the first English theaters to include artificial lighting, which enabled nighttime performances. Designed to appeal to wealthy patrons only, the Blackfriars did not have inexpensive seats or a space set aside for groundlings. Indoor theaters of this sort, attracting a fashionable crowd, would become the norm in centuries to come. Go ahead and turn the page, and let's now continue with our preparations for the study of Julius Caesar. We began on 887 with literary analysis, Shakespeare's tragedies. Make sure this is in your notes. And again, this is going to be summary review of what we did when you were in your freshman year with us studying Romeo and Juliet. Like other tragedies, Shakespeare's tragedies are plays that tell of a reversal of fortune from good to bad, experienced by a man or woman usually of noble birth. Shakespeare's tragedies also have these distinct features. By the way, so much of this is born of our study of Aristotle's Poetics, you'll remember. 1, they're sometimes based on historical characters. Obviously, there really was a Julius Caesar and a Brutus, right? 2, the hero often develops a tragic flaw, as we learned about it in our study of Antigone, the characteristic that brings down his or her downfall. Shakespeare emphasizes the hero's internal conflict. Commoners often play key supporting roles and provide comic relief, write that term down, in humorous scenes that serve as a break from the intense emotions of the play. Shakespeare's plays are structured in 5 acts, write that down. In his tragedies, the crisis, the turning point that determines how the play will end, occurs in Act 3. So Act 3 in Shakespeare plays always it's so important. The climax or point of greatest emotional intensity often occurs in Act 5, when the catastrophe or disaster befalls the hero. You're going to use a plot diagram like the one that's provided on 887 as we go through our study of Julius Caesar. On to page 888, your vocabulary will obviously be a part of our study as we go through this play. Pay attention to this vocabulary. And of course, the big question, to what extent does experience determine what we perceive? Now let's get some background for the play Julius Caesar before we get into this play. On 889, a noble Roman. William Shakespeare may be the most famous person ever to write in England, but Julius Caesar, Roman general and statesman, was one of the first ever to write about it. In his account of his military exploits in Gaul, modern-day France and Belgium, Caesar describes the island of Britain and its inhabitants. Caesar invaded the island twice, in 55 and 54 BC, but he did not remain there long. About a century later, however, the Romans returned to make the area of Britain that we now call England an outpost of their empire. The land remained in Roman hands until about AD 400, when the empire was collapsing and Roman troops were called home to defend their capital. As part of English history, Julius Caesar and ancient Rome were of particular interest to English writers and audiences. Rome in Caesar's day, our next heading. Since about 509 BC, Rome had been a republic, a society ruled by a democratically elected government. 2 public officials called consuls shared governing authority with the Senate and the assemblies. Members of the Senate were highborn Romans, called patricians, while members of the assemblies were lowborn Romans, called plebeians. By the era of Julius Caesar, 100 to 44 BC, Rome controlled a great empire through military expansion. However, the popularity of military leaders threatened the balance of power, and civil war became common. When a general named Pompey tried to make himself sole consul, another popular general, Julius Caesar, defeated him. As Shakespeare's play opens, all of Rome wonders whether Caesar will appoint himself emperor, thus ending the Republic. By the way, notice over on the box there on 889, from the name Caesar came the German word Kaiser and the Russian word Tsar, both meaning emperor. From Julius Caesar's first name comes July, our word for the month named in Julius Caesar's honor. Now we want to talk really quickly about Plutarch, and I've given a lecture on Plutarch on learnstrong.net in the Harvard Classics folder if you want to go and take a look in more detail. Plutarch, Shakespeare's source. Shakespeare's source for the tragedy of Julius Caesar was The Lives of the Noble Grecians and Romans, Sir Thomas North's 1579 English translation of a book by the Greek philosopher Plutarch. Written late in the 1st century, Plutarch's lives included literary sketches of Julius Caesar, Marcus Brutus, and Marcus Antony, right? Who had lived just over a century earlier. Plutarch researched his information carefully, although he focused less on historical facts than on the personalities of his subjects. Shakespeare based his plot on the events Plutarch describes, but he condensed the timeline and added dramatic elements. For example, Plutarch writes that Antinous gave a funeral oration that stirred the common people to compassion and rage. Shakespeare did not know what Mark Antony actually said, but he gives us the speech as he imagined it. And when we get to that speech, we will, of course, point out one of the most famous speeches ever written, right, especially in the history of the stage. Let's remind ourselves about William Shakespeare on page 890. Notice the dates, 1564 to 1616. Unlike other famed writers of his time, Shakespeare was neither a lofty aristocrat nor a university scholar. Nevertheless, he's widely regarded as the greatest writer in the English language. Some, of course, have said he's the greatest writer in the history of all languages. What's past is prologue, quote unquote. Next heading. Shakespeare was born in Stratford-upon-Avon, a market town on the Avon River, about 70 miles northwest of London. His father, John, was a successful glove maker who served for a time as town mayor. His mother, born Mary Arden, was the daughter of a wealthy farmer who owned the land on which John Shakespeare's father lived. Although the records have been lost, it's believed that Shakespeare attended the Stratford Grammar School, where he would have studied logic, history, Latin grammar, some Greek, and works by the Roman poets Ovid, Horace, Virgil, and the Roman playwrights Plautus and Terence. When he left school, he would thus have had a solid foundation in classical literature. The next heading, All the World's a Stage. In 1582, when he was 18, Shakespeare married a woman named Anne Hathaway, who was 26. The couple had a daughter, Susanna, in 1583, and twins, Judith and Hamnet, 2 years later. No one knows what Shakespeare did for the next several years, but in the early 1590s, his name began to appear in the world of the London theater. Working first as an actor, Shakespeare soon began writing plays. By 1594, he was part owner and principal playwright of the Lord Chamberlain's Men, the acting company run by the Burbages. As the leading actor in most of Shakespeare's plays, Richard Burbage was also becoming famous. Soon, he decided to move the company to the new theater district in Southwark. There, Burbage oversaw the construction of the Globe Theatre, which was larger than the company's old home in London. With bigger audiences, profits increased for Burbage, Shakespeare, and all the other co-owners. The Lord Chamberlain's Men was named for its sponsors. First, Henry Carey, Lord Hunsdon, and then his son, George. Both men served in the high government post of Lord Chamberlain. After Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603, her successor, James I, became the company's patron. In his honor, the company changed its name to the King's Men. Final heading on 890, Parting is Such Sweet Sorrow. In 1609, the King's Men began to perform year-round, using the Globe Theatre in summer and the Blackfriars during the colder months. Profits increased even more, And about a year later, Shakespeare was able to retire. He returned to his childhood home of Stratford, where he bought the second largest house in town, invested in land, and continued to write. Shakespeare died in 1616, leaving the bulk of his estate to his elder daughter, Susanna, and a smaller sum to Judith. Hamlet had died in 1596. We'll talk more about him when we study in our senior year the play Hamlet. Okay, let's go to 891, Shakespeare's Influence. Nearly 400 years after his death, William Shakespeare remains the most influential writer in the English language. His characters are known by name around the world. Filmmakers, painters, novelists, and composers reuse his plots, and phrases he coined still slip into daily conversation. You've probably quoted Shakespeare without even knowing it. Here are just a few examples of expressions made famous in his plays. All the world's a stage, from As You Like It. Brave new world, from The Tempest. Brevity is the soul of wit, from Hamlet. Come full circle, King Lear. Dish fit for the gods, Julius Caesar. We'll see that one. A foregone conclusion, Othello. It was Greek to me, Julius Caesar. Lend me your ears, Julius Caesar. Loved not wisely, but loved too well, Othello. More sinned against than sinning, King Lear. Neither a borrower nor a lender be, Hamlet. Once more into the breach, Henry V. Parting is such sweet sorrow. We saw that last year in our freshman study of Romeo and Juliet. Strange bedfellows, The Tempest. Throw cold water on it, The Merry Wives of Windsor. Too much of a good theme, As You Like It. What's past is prologue, The Tempest. Notice the box on 891, the authorship question. This is still somewhat debated. You can go on YouTube and see video about this. Because the documentary evidence of Shakespeare's life is slim and his roots fairly humble, some have questioned whether he really wrote the plays with which he's credited. Shakespeare scholars believe that the surviving texts of the plays were edited, and that a few late plays even had co-authors, but nearly all dismiss the notion that Shakespeare did not write these plays. Nevertheless, the theories persist. Several suggest that Will Shakespeare, actor and Burbage business partner,